So, we heard Dave Boundy say earlier today that roadmap that was established by Gordon Moore provided the future plan for us that we could follow, predicted where we needed to go, and yet we know it's going away. Gordon Moore himself says that no exponential is forever. Now, we all know that Moore's law says that the number of transistors in our largest chips doubles every year, just as Gordon Moore said it when he presented the paper in 1965. Or was it every 2 years, as he revised it 20 years later in 1975? Perhaps it was every 18 months, as he revised it again in 1997, and as he then proceeded to give further modifications so that in 2003, he declared it good for another decade at the 18-month level. And when he was asked what did he want his legacy to be, Gordon Moore said, anything but Moore's law. Well, so it's a very strange thing. Here we have a, quote, law based upon 4 data points taken one per year, starting in 1962, and taking the number of transistors and putting it on a log base 2 scale, and getting a straight line that all of us then followed for the next 45 years. Really remarkable. The reason it's actually not so remarkable is that this empirical observation that Gordon Moore made actually was based on a real law of nature, and that law is called the learning curve. And in fact, Moore's law and the learning curve are exactly the same when 2 things are true. One, when the cumulative number of transistors increases exponentially every year, and when almost all cost reduction comes from shrinking feature sizes and growing wafer diameters. When that is true, Moore's law equals the learning curve, and of course the confusion over 2 years, 1 year, and so on was because early in the semiconductor industry, the number of transistors didn't grow exponentially each year, but they have since 1970. So we should say a word about learning curves. Learning curves have been around a long time, approaching 100 years, and they are log-log plots. On the horizontal axis, you plot the cumulative number of units of anything produced throughout history. Remember, Moore's law is chronological, it's linear with time. The learning curve is logarithmic, and so if the units grow exponentially, then they line up. They're linear in time and exponential in units. The vertical axis is the log of cost per unit, revenue per unit, can even be parts per million defective. And there are a couple caveats. First of all, you have to correct for governmentally induced inflation, so it has to be measured in constant currency, and they have to be free markets. You can't have trade barriers or price fixing and other things. And then the horizontal axis is simply plotting the units, which obviously, since it's logarithmic over time, it slows down and doesn't move as fast to the right. Now, if you look at the learning curve for the semiconductor industry or any other, you find that every time you double the cumulative volume produced through history, you decrease the cost per unit or the revenue per unit by a fixed %. This is the semiconductor learning curve from 1954 through 2012. Pretty good linear plot. It actually averages out in Moore's law's terms to about a 30% per year reduction in the cost per transistor. And people have plotted all kinds of learning curves. There's simple ones like the personal computer lines up very nicely on a learning curve, and so do most high-tech products and services. Now, the good part is that the learning curve doesn't care how you get there, it only predicts that you will get there. So if a particular technology is not the most effective, then you have to switch technologies, just as we saw in switches, which vacuum tubes in the 1940s were the most efficient way to make a switch. That gave way to discrete transistors in the 50s and 60s, and to the integrated circuit in the most recent 45 years, the Moore's Law era. But what we know for sure is we don't have to worry about Moore's Law going away because we still have the learning curve, and we can, in fact, predict when we have to switch to the next switch from the integrated circuit. And we don't know what it will be. It may be nanotubes or bioswitches or whatever. All we do know for sure is that line will be continued because it always is. So we've had a very stable ecosystem for quite a long period of time. If you go back to the 1.5 micron era, we see that each generation we shrink in linear dimension by 70%, well, 0.7. 0.7 times 0.7 is 0.49. So we cut the size in half for a given number of transistors, or we get twice the number of transistors per unit area. And that's created a very stable ecosystem. And that ecosystem has been stable partly because everyone knows what they have to do to continue to be their part of the cost reduction. So the capital equipment manufacturers, for example, have to increase or have had to increase or decrease the depreciation cost per transistor by 35% per year. And the foundries, or those who produce wafers, typically double the number of transistors per wafer every time you trigger a new generation. And the fabless companies then take twice the number of transistors and translate them roughly into about a 1.7x multiple, because they do have bond pads and analog and things that don't shrink. And the user gets just slightly less than that. As an end user, they're the big winners. They get more than 1.5 times the functionality for the same price as the previous generation, and it's stable. Everybody has the model, everyone runs the same margins. It's all very, very self-reinforcing until 20 nanometers. Then a surprise came. This was the ISSCC presentation given by Lisa Su of AMD, where she pointed out that at 20 nanometers, all of a sudden, this goodness came to an end. We see the cost per transistor all of a sudden went flat, area scaling slowed down, and all of a sudden, we no longer have the magic of Moore's Law, which is indeed the magic of the learning curve. Well, there are a lot of reasons this happened, but the problem shows itself in the actual cost of wafers. The foundries that have been in the business a long time have been used to pricing the next generation of wafer at 15 to 20% more than the previous generation, and that's what their customers expect. 28 nanometer sort of pushed the edge of that. 20 nanometer pushed it clear to 28%, and as we go to what is euphemistically called 14 and 16 nanometers, which is actually 20 nanometers with a FinFET, you get no additional transistors, and it probably will come down from this, but right now is projected to be a 40% increase, and that will not allow the traditional 30% per year reduction in the cost per transistor. Why did this happen? Well, what drove it originally is that we were planning to introduce extreme UV, and all of the numbers worked out if you could get 120 watts out of the extreme UV machines and a throughput per hour that increased, as we have done with all lithographic equipment in history. Because we didn't have it, we did double patterning, double etch. That is, you have 193 nanometer illumination, and you're trying to define parts that are 20 nanometer nominal feature size, so you play tricks on the optics and tricks in the process, do double pattern, double etch. When we go to 1416, we throw in a FinFET, we do even more double patterning and double etching, and we still have no EUV. Same thing at 10 nanometer. Now EUV has pretty well slipped out of that, maybe a little hope, but not much. We throw in self-aligned double patterning, now triple pattern, triple etch. We've added all this process technology, and we haven't added that many transistors, although we will have another doubling here. So we're going to have to squeeze everybody's profit margin, because that's the only way we can reduce our cost per transistor, stay on the learning curve, and stimulate new applications and activity. So who do we squeeze? I have some candidates. How about the food chain of suppliers to the industry? Let's start with the wafer fab. Well, if you take published data from the SIA, you can find the number of transistors that are shipped every year. They've been publishing it for over 40 years, or 30 years now. So you take the number of transistors, and you can take total semiconductor revenue, integrated circuit revenue in this case, and Semi publishes the dollar value of wafer fab equipment shipped. You divide by the number of transistors, and you can see the cost of fabrication equipment per transistor and the total semiconductor industry cost per transistor. And guess what? The two lines are absolutely parallel, as they must be, because if that equipment started going up this direction, then all of a sudden we would have a problem, but we don't have a problem. They continue to reduce their costs per transistor right along with the semiconductor industry. This is one of the most amazing ones. Here we have a virtual monopoly with ASML. They can charge whatever they want to charge, and yet they are reducing the cost of lithographic equipment per transistor at exactly the same rate as the overall semiconductor industry is reducing what it charges per transistor, so they are not a problem. Why would they do this? Because they want to maximize their profit. They charge too much, demand will go down. They charge too little, they leave money on the table, so they charge the optimum to maximize profit. Assembly equipment, the same story. You can get this data from Semi, just divide by the number of transistors. The two lines are parallel, so the cost of assembly equipment per transistor is coming down at the same rate as the semiconductor industry revenue has to reduce its cost per transistor. Automated test equipment. This is a very interesting one because you can see it is also on a parallel learning curve, but take a look back here around, this is about the year 2000, and notice what was happening. It was deviating off a straight line. And that's why the learning curves are so valuable. You could see, wait a minute, we're going to get in trouble somewhere along here. And in fact, a lot of people talked about this. They talked about the fact that IC selling prices were coming down and test costs were not. Pat Gelsinger of Intel, in his 1999 ITC address, the International Test Conference, pointed out that it may cost more to test a transistor than it costs to make it, and so something had to happen. What happened? In 2001, a very brilliant guy, Janusz Reisky in the EDA industry, came up with a software approach to compress test vectors so you could test 200 times as much, and now approaching 700 or 800 times as much. At that time, it started about 100, with the same tester, without adding capacity, and as a result, the ATE industry got back on the learning curve. In 2012 alone, that was $25 billion worth of testers that the industry did not buy because they had software to compress their test vectors. So whenever you get off a learning curve, you need to look for an innovation. Now, what about EDA? Now, everyone I talk to says, you guys, you charge ridiculous prices, you never lower your prices, how come you can't give us a break? Well, let me show you. On a per transistor basis, the EDA industry, data is published, the industry is $6.5 billion. The semiconductor industry is $320 billion. If you go back 20 years, EDA software has been 2% of semiconductor revenue, and it's stayed that way. So by definition, it's been parallel to the learning curve, and in fact, the industry invests a large amount enhancing the software every year to handle bigger and bigger chips. So in fact, on a cost per transistor basis, EDA isn't the problem either. So I've been through all these source areas of cost. Nobody seems to be too far out of line. So one has to ask, okay, hey, Silicon Foundries, they're the ones who are charging more for the wafers. Why can't they go squeeze their margins? After all, these people have been doing really well. If you look at the public data for Foundries, which doesn't include Samsung, but it includes most of the others, you find that they have doubled their gross margins over the last 10 years. So, hey, a little squeeze wouldn't hurt that much for these people. One thing I have to caution you with, though, is if you pull Taiwan Semiconductor out of the data, then it's not such a good business after all. You know, it's runs somewhere between 0 and 20% gross margin. So TSMC is getting the lion's share of the profit. And not only that, they actually are doing more than their share of the cost reduction. If you go back to one of the great constants of semiconductor history, Tommy George of Motorola/Freescale used to show me the data that went back all the way to germanium transistors. The revenue per unit area has been a constant. And so there's the revenue per unit area for CMOS logic. And here you see the foundries are actually selling more silicon for less money. So they're actually contributing ahead of the long-term trend. So it's hard to tag them with the problem. So let's go after the semiconductor companies. What do we have here? So these people have improved their margins in the last 10 years as the fabless companies by about 12, 13 points. You know, they could handle a few points of squeeze. And there it is without Qualcomm. But, you know, it's still about a 10-point increase. So they're doing pretty well. And so are the IDMs, about the same increase. So maybe the squeeze comes there. What about the end users? They are getting this terrific deal. They get 1.5 times what they got a few years ago, and they get it all for the same price. Maybe they get 1.4, 1.3. They'd still be pretty happy. So let's take a look at the customers that we sell integrated circuits to. Starting with the mobile phone industry, they used to make 40% gross margins. You know, a lot of pressure now in consolidation. Samsung and Apple probably make money, but most of these, you know, it's dropping pretty fast. If we take a look at, say, the PC industry, those people used to make about 40% gross margin. Now they make about 20%. Not a lot of room to squeeze margin out of that. And if you look at the electronic assemblers, they used to have a miserable business that ran about 15% gross margin. Now they have an even more miserable business that runs about 10% gross margin. There's just not a lot of room to squeeze those margins and keep us on the learning curve. So, what do we do? Is it, in fact, possible to stay on the learning curve without squeezing the margins of the people who produce the product? Well, one way might be, since the silicon foundries are already doing even more than their share, maybe there are some more innovations available. And so I searched the data, and surprisingly, from a new foundry supplier, Intel, who intends to supply wafers at 14 nanometers, they published some data presented at a securities conference where they show effectively a learning curve because, in fact, this is time and this is log of cost. But what they're saying is the cost per transistor is going to stay on a constant reduction on a logarithmic scale. And so when I first did this study, I turned this over to Daniel Nenny, who's been blogging about it ever since, saying it can't possibly be true. But I also took it back to Bill Holt at Intel, who says it is true. So at least some possibility that the foundries will find a way to continue to reduce their costs down to 10 nanometers. Another thing you could do would be slow down the learning curve. After all, when a new product or new technology is introduced, the first doubling of volume occurs quickly, and then as you build up cumulative volume, it takes longer and longer to do the next doubling, even though you're on a straight line on a log-log plot. And so what happens is when products become mature, they no longer fall in cost very rapidly. In fact, for really mature products, the growth in unit volume is in the single digits, so inflation more than overwhelms any cost reduction. And so for cars and cotton and steel and other things, we don't even notice the reduction each year. But semiconductors are unique. We grow the unit volume 72% every year, and that stimulates the cost reduction, which enables the new applications, which is what makes the industry great. So slowing it down is not a very good idea, especially when we have so much growth in applications. The amount of data, movies, downloads, storage, everything which is growing at either geometric or exponential rates, we have the demand to continue down the learning curve. Slowing down is not a good idea. It makes your industry boring, just like other mature industries. So, the other possibility, other new innovations. Staying on the learning curve really doesn't require Moore's law scaling. Take, for example, Samsung introduced a non-volatile stacked DRAM for, static DRAM for demonstration purposes, a non-volatile memory actually. And they doubled the number of die, put 48 on top. Right now, it's not that cost effective, but ultimately it avoids 48 packages, you reduce costs, you get more functionality per unit area, you save board space, and the same thing is true of logic, stacked die, multiple die on interposers, flip DRAM on processors. We also have all sorts of other alternatives. You can integrate MEMS with the logic processor, you can integrate photonics, you can go to a new switch, spintronics, magnetoresistive memory storage. At 7 nanometers, you're going to see indium gallium arsenide. So there are lots of new possibilities. The one that's most amazing to me is the potential in bio, where you see these are orders of magnitude. This is the cost per base pair for DNA sequencing. Notice its learning curve is far steeper than the semiconductor industry. This is the largest amount of archival storage done with DNA each year. You can see the most recent jump by Professor Church at Harvard was a 75,000 word book stored in DNA with a quaternary system, 4 proteins, and actually stored the entire book. Admittedly, it doesn't have a very fast read time, but if you just look at the biosystems, we have 3 orders of magnitude available to us in density and 9 orders of magnitude available to us in power. So there's lots of room to move ahead. It just requires that, in fact, we take advantage of it and continue to push the learning curve. So we need to offset the cost of double and triple patterning, plus the effect of FinFETs to continue that 70% per year growth in unit volume. We could put price pressure on the foundries. We could put margin pressure on the semiconductor companies. We could force the supply chain to reduce its costs faster than the long-term learning curve. We could slow down the rate of unit growth and consequently the innovation in new applications of semiconductor electronics. Or we can do what I would prefer, which is in fact innovate to maintain the unit volume growth and the consequent cost reduction that comes with it. Thank you.